Hi, this is Prayas from No Nonsense Airbnb, and in this video we will talk about Airbnb versus renting. Everyone who has a property and who decides to, start looking at Airbnb, we all have that thing in mind, whether I should stick to long-term renting or Airbnb is the right thing for me. I'm a landlord too. I used to have my two properties on long-term renting, and I took the plunge. And looking back 5 years when I started Airbnb, I think it was a good decision, but there are clear advantages and disadvantages of both these options. So the biggest difference is Airbnb is not real estate, it is hospitality. Okay. You will need to wear your customer services hat. Okay. You will need to communicate with the guests. You will need to look after your property. You will need to look after the cleaning of the property, maintenance of the property. Whereas when you have a long-term tenant, you kind of pass them the keys and just look after the general maintenance of the building, but the general upkeep, looking after the property, is the tenant's problem. Okay, so that is the biggest and the first difference I would like to highlight. Airbnb is hospitality, it is not real estate. Next is financial fluctuation. Okay, because Airbnb is hospitality, there are high seasons, there are low seasons. Okay, there will be times when there are lots of people looking for a short-term rental property in your area. Whereas there will be times, no matter where you are, we all have winter, summer seasons. Okay, no matter where you are, there will be times when there are less people looking for a short-term accommodation. Okay, so there will be a fluctuation in your monthly income. Whereas when you have a long-term tenant, you just simply pass them the keys and then you get a fixed monthly rent, right? That is not going to be the case when you're renting on Airbnb. For example, in Edinburgh, we make about 3 to 4 times the monthly rent in August, which is our peak. Whereas January is the lowest month, is the slowest month in Edinburgh, where we make about half of the monthly rent. So there will be that fluctuation when you're renting on Airbnb. So you will need to think whether your financial situation can accommodate that kind of variance in your monthly rental. That is the second biggest difference between Airbnb and renting. The third difference is Airbnb will need your time commitment. Okay, you will need to communicate with the guest, answer their queries about your property, pass them the check-in instructions, keep asking them if there is any problem or deal with any kind of problem they're having. Whereas, renting doesn't really need any kind of time commitment from you. You just pass them the keys and then they just look after the property and start living there. Airbnb will need your time commitment. You will need to spend effort to keep your property, in a nice order, look after the cleaning, maintenance, keep it nice and tidy all the time. So that is the third big difference between Airbnb and renting. The next is the utilities, right? When you have a long-term tenant, they pay all the utilities, electricity, gas, any kind of, TV, broadband, and any kind of tax, council tax you pay or the city tax you pay. Whereas when you're renting on Airbnb, you will be paying all those things because people who are going to come and stay in your property, they will just pay a fixed nightly price to you. And then it is your responsibility to pay all the, bills. So on Airbnb, basically you pay all the bills and that involves a lot more hassle. Whereas on a long-term tenant, they pay all the bills and it is less hassle for you. The next difference is there is a lot more upfront cost when you're renting your property on Airbnb because it has to be furnished property. It always has to be a furnished property when you're renting on Airbnb. It needs to have all the beds, sofas, TV, broadband, all the kitchen appliances, the kitchen has to be fully equipped and all those kind of things. Whereas when you have a long-term tenant, you can almost choose what kind of things you want to provide. You may choose not to provide anything and just give them the empty property and they bring their own stuff. So that way you have an upfront cost when you're setting up an Airbnb. Whereas, normal tenancy, you do not necessarily need to spend anything to furnish the property. But at the same time, as I said, you can expect higher returns when you're renting on Airbnb, and that kind of rewards you for the upfront cost which you pay when you're setting up a property for Airbnb. Next is you get a lot more access to your property when you're renting it on Airbnb. Whereas, when you have a long-term tenant, you cannot really go there. You need to take an appointment to go there. Whereas when you have property running on Airbnb, you can access the property during the cleaning times. Your cleaner will be going there multiple times a week. If you want to go there and stay for certain nights, you can simply block your calendar and just use your property. When you have a friend and family coming to the area, you can simply block the calendar and use the property. Whereas all this is not possible when you have a long-term tenant, because you cannot really access the property until they are there. Next is you get a lot more access to your property when you're renting it on Airbnb. You can simply block the calendar whenever you wish to use your property, if you want to go there and stay for a night or two, or if you have a friend and family visiting the area, you can just simply block the calendar and let them use it. Whereas all these things are not possible when you have a long-term tenant, because you have minimum length of contract and you can only go and live there once the contract expires. Okay, so that way you get a lot more access to your property. Next is on Airbnb, you get to access maintenance issues very, very quickly. Anything goes wrong in your property, the first person who will come screaming at you will be your guest. On top of that, your cleaner will be going there multiple times a week, and even you can visit the property during the cleaning time. So that way, you get to know any kind of problems in your property very, very quickly. Whereas when you have a long-term tenant, you kind of rely on them to tell you if there is any problem. And if they choose to ignore something until it becomes too big, then it leads to a lot of expenses. So in that way, you get, you stay on top of anything that goes wrong in your property. So that is another advantage of having Airbnb versus long-term renting. Next is late or missed payments. So, when you have a long-term tenant, they may get into financial difficulties, or they may just simply choose not to pay the monthly rent. And usually the way to get that cost from them is to go to courts and fight a legal battle. Whereas when you have an Airbnb tenant, Airbnb ensures that they collect all the money from them and they pay you, and whenever the time comes. So you're kind of assured for your for the rent when you're renting on Airbnb. Whereas when you have a long-term tenant, there is always that risk of they're not paying the rent, and then you have to fight the long, lengthy legal battle to get some of that money back, if not all. Next is you will need to learn how to run a property on Airbnb. You will need to understand how the website works, how to create a listing, how to send messages, how to inform your cleaners, and all those things. How to maintain your prices, how to maintain your availability, and all those kind of things. So it needs a bit of technical skills, computer skills. Whereas all that is not required for long-term tenancy. You can just hire an agency to do it for you. You can do that. You can hire an agency to manage your property as well. But tenancy, you can literally do it yourself as well, like most people. But Airbnb needs, certain kind of computer skills. You will need to spend a significant amount of time to understand how it works. But in the end, it is equally rewarding if your property is suitable for an Airbnb business. Next is you cannot change your mind when you have a long-term tenant, right? So you have a tenant moved in, and two months later or 5 months later, you cannot really change your mind. Whereas on Airbnb, you can literally experiment for a month or 3 months and then see how it goes. And if it goes in your way, you can just carry on doing it. Otherwise, you can just change your mind and move to long-term renting. So that way on Airbnb, you can really, be flexible in your options. Whereas once you have signed a contract with a long-term tenant, you cannot really change your mind. Next is insurance. When you have a long-term tenant, you will need your building insurance to, insure your house. Whereas when you have, and when you're running your property on Airbnb, Airbnb gives you two kinds of insurances. One is 1 million insurance for liability claim, $1 million. And another one is $1 million, damage claim, any damages done to your property. On top of that, this Airbnb insurance you will get by default. You don't have to pay anything, and it is always there as long as you have a tenant staying from Airbnb. On top of that, you will need an additional short-term rental insurance for your property. Not the general house insurance. They do not usually cover short-term rental properties. You will need to get a specialist Airbnb short-term rental insurance for your property to cover your property, because although the Airbnb insurance is there, but it purely covers any damages done to your property by the guest. Okay, so not all the problems or all the damages are going to be because of the guest negligence. There can be damages done to your property when there is no one staying there, right? So you will need that special short-term rental insurance when you're renting on Airbnb. Whereas when you have a long-term tenant, you will need that landlord's house insurance or whatever it is called in your area. Next is regulations, right? Normally, in cities around the world, the regulations are really conducive. They're encouraging people to rent their extra property, additional properties to long-term tenants, whereas there could be restrictions and regulations around letting your property on short-term rental websites like Airbnb. So you will need to be aware of what kind of regulations and restrictions apply to Airbnb in your area. Make sure you familiarize yourself, and I will drop a link in the description below. Airbnb keeps a central repository of all the local restrictions and regulations that apply to them. Just go to that link, drill down to your city or area. If you find it there, they will have listed all the restrictions. If you don't find it there, that means there are no restrictions. Okay, depending on the restrictions you find, that might limit the amount of revenue you may be able to generate from Airbnb. So very important to make sure you're fully aware of any kind of restrictions and regulations that apply to Airbnb. Whereas long-term tenancy, there are usually not many regulations and restrictions around that. You can literally rent it as long as you want. So, that way there is a big difference in regulations as well. Next is suitability. Not every property is suitable for Airbnb. Generally properties which are in the city center or near a business hub or a landmark or any touristy spot, they generally get a lot more bookings and they get a lot more higher returns than other properties which are on Airbnb but far away from the city center. Okay, so there is that advantage of location depending on where your property is. Whereas on long-term tenancy, people generally prefer to stay away from all the action in the city. So you're kind of assured of a tenant no matter where your property is. Whereas on Airbnb, depending on the kind of property you have, the location of the property, there could be an impact on the occupancy of your property. So keep that in mind. That is one important factor that may impact the success of your Airbnb business. But these are all the differences, when it comes to comparing Airbnb versus renting. I hope you found this video useful. Please, leave a comment in the description if you want me to create a video about something very specific. I will be happy to make a video on that. Please do like and subscribe to my channel. That will encourage me to make more such videos. And until next time, bye-bye.